Here we have a Next.js project with GraphQL Mesh installed as a dependency. If you have a look inside of the package.json, you'll see all of the GraphQL Mesh packages and Next.js with GraphQL and TypeScript. You'll see we have two commands to generate and run the dev server for GraphQL Mesh. So let's go ahead and run the GraphQL Mesh server by running npm run mesh. Over on localhost 4000, we have the GraphQL Mesh server running. That is bringing both of the sources that we have defined in the configuration. We can fetch the cities where the name prefix is Newcastle upon Tyne, and we can fetch the name, latitude, longitude, and the population. But also we can make a query to fetch the current weather by longitude and latitude using the weather-bit API. So if we run the query to get the daily forecast, we can pass the latitude and longitude from the previous results of our find cities using get. We'll also need to pass the key, which is the API key for weatherbit, and pass that along inside of the query arguments. Then we can fetch the data of the response here, and we'll just fetch the minimum and maximum temperature for that day. If you see here, this will return an array. We can also update the query and the arguments and pass in the number of days that we want to return in the data array. So we'll make this 1. What we'd like to do is return the current temperature, minimum and maximum temperatures for the current city that we fetch using the find cities using get query. So we can't just fetch the minimum and maximum temperature inside of the query here because this doesn't exist. What we need to do is extend the schema and resolvers to achieve this. Inside of the mesh.rc YAML file, let's define the additional type definitions for our project. Here we can extend the type for the populated places, and if we open this up in the documentation, you can see the actual type we want to return is the populated places summary. Then inside of the populated places summary type, we'll define the field today forecast and we'll return the forecast type for this field. If we have a look inside of the documentation now, you can see that we have the today forecast field with the forecast type as the response. And you can see that this is the forecast response from the weatherbit API. Now if we open GraphQL and rerun the query, passing the GraphQL variable name Newcastle upon Tyne for the city we want to fetch, you'll see we have null returned for the today forecast field. Inside of the mesh.rc YAML file for GraphQL Mesh, let's define the additional resolvers for our extended types above. First we'll need to define the target type. And the target type here will be populated place summary. This is the type we want to create a resolver for. Then we need to define the target field name, and we created the field name today forecast. We then need to define the required selection set of latitude and longitude, and the source name, type, and the field name. The field name will match the query we previously ran to get the weather by the latitude and longitude, and we'll pass the selection set to this query. Now let's define the arguments for the source. For the latitude, we'll pass in the root.latitude, and this will come from the required selection set that we defined above. And we'll do the same for the longitude. Then we need to define the number of days. In this case, we'll just return the 1. Then you'll need to pass in your API key as key to the source args. And then for the additional resolver, we'll pass the result, and the result that will return will be the first from the array of the forecast. And we can see here that the type is returned to us in an array, data forecast. Now let's go ahead and rerun the query. And we can see here that the minimum and maximum temperature has been returned to the today forecast field for the current city. Now let's run the Next.js dev server by running npm run dev. And if we head to localhost 3000, you'll see here we have null returned to us. First, let's create a query in the GraphQL folder, and we'll call this get city and weather by name.gql. This is where we'll write the query that we previously ran inside of GraphQL. We'll pass along the name as a string as a GraphQL variable, and we'll pass that to the name prefix field on the find cities using get, and then we'll return the data name and the today forecast, minimum and maximum temperatures. If you've worked with GraphQL code generator before, this will look a little familiar. Inside the mesh.rc YAML file, let's go and define a glob for the documents for our GraphQL files. So here we'll just pass the path GraphQL/, and then we'll just glob any file inside of any folder that ends in GQL or GraphQL. Now let's go ahead and run npm run generate, and this is going to build the GraphQL mesh for us. Now that it's successfully ran, if we open the .mesh file in the root of our project, you can see some automatically generated code. And if we search here, we can see our query. This is exported to us as a document. But also, if we scroll down, we can see that we have this SDK, and we have a function here that accepts some variables and options and returns the SDK and running that query. All that's left to do is import the getMesh SDK and invoke that inside of the getStaticProps lifecycle method from Next.js. And from this, we'll get the query we wrote earlier, get city and weather by name. Then all that's left to do is pass the query, passing the variables, and we'll return from here the query name and the response data, and we'll pass the data to the page as a prop. Then all that's left to do is go ahead and run npm Run Dev, head on over to localhost 3000, and what we'll see now is we have an array of all our responses from the API. Here we have the city name and the temperature, minimum and maximum from another API, stitched together as one.